What's going on, guys? We are back tonight with another Buff Nerf video for you. I haven't done one in quite a while, and this is a speculation video, of course, because they haven't obviously released any news that I'm aware of upcoming buffs and nerfs, but I have a hunch because how the meta has kind of shaken out recently, we had this same issue back in the day with 8 Immortals kind of overtaking the meta, and it gets what I like to say, stale. So basically, it seems like all we play against lately, especially down in the lower levels, are bird decks, shark decks, kind of very repetitive. So, in my mind, the meta's stale. So really, there's only one way to shake that up is either release some really good new player cards that can kind of help them branch into other archetypes, which isn't a guarantee that they'll do that. So in my mind, you have to nerf some of those cards within those decks to force them to branch into some different decks, right? Because right now it's just not making the game very fun, in my opinion, to where I've talked to a lot of players that are kind of bored out or burned out with the game. They just kind of sick of playing those decks over and over and over. So like I said, very similar to what happened with 8 Immortals. So I have a hunch sooner or later they are going to have to do something about it, or they're just going to keep losing players. I mean, that's how this goes. If you're not having fun playing the game, why play the game, right? So I have created a little Nerf list, and I've even added some buffs as well that I think hopefully to spice the meta up is kind of what I'm going for. Something to, put some of them decks down a little bit and hopefully buff up some decks that could use a little help and maybe spice up the meta. So maybe add some archetypes. I've also got a couple mechanics, and this is one thing I'm a little disappointed they haven't taken advantage of yet. With so many cards in this game, it seems Avid has only really been focusing on buff cards, just cards that just buff, and that is so straightforward and so boring in my opinion. There is so much more they can do with this game, and it's like they're hesitant, and I don't like that. I want them to explore options, try them out, and potentially we can expand on it and make the game better going forward, more fun to play, more different paths to victory, not just the same buff our cards, win the game. It's just stale. And I don't want to harbor on that too much longer, but let's go. What am I going to a deck here? Oh, and as most of you know, the reason I haven't been recording really much this week is trade restrictions. So just to show you guys, I can't get the cards I need for the decks, so haven't been doing videos. Kind of switched gears into Magic this week, so did a couple Magic videos. If you guys are interested in those, go check that out. I'm still hitting decks for some reason. Why am I hitting decks? All right, so my first card on the list, and I'm not going to hit birds right out the gate. I just did it again. Why am I doing that? I didn't hit birds right out the gate. I went and hit Folio. So this card has been a powerhouse lately in this game. I think it's a little too strong because it's giving you permanent power on 6 cards, which is really good. That's a third of your deck getting plus 25 permanent power. So I'm thinking this card needs to drop from plus 25 perm down to plus 18 perm. I think that will make it a little more balanced and not feel so strong that it's like you have to play this or you're going to lose, type feeling. I don't like that feeling of pigeonholed into one archetype because it's so strong. So I think they need to drop that down a little bit personally. Next card I think they need to take a look at is Identity Theft. This card's very strong, buffing a lot of times, most times I'd say plus 40 until played. I mean, if not plus 40, very close to plus 40 on your cards for the turn, and that's extremely strong for 8 mana. Already giving you 68 power, you're going to get another plus potential 120. That's really good. So I think they need to ding this down. Now, I could see this, instead of being good in the early game, let's make this more of a late game card that says basically instead of plus 4 until played, plus 2 permanent. So those cards now don't get as big a buff in the beginning. They could potentially only get the plus 20, but into the late game now, this card is a powerhouse and could basically win games late. So that's what I would do, just kind of give a little bit more late game action to it. Moving on, I do want to touch on the birds. Obviously, that's one of the reasons this meta is so stale right now. And, I'm in, am I in there? Okay, there he is. Egyptian Nightjar. For a rare, not even a limited card, this card buffs your birds in hand plus 25 this turn. And that's only for 3 energy. That is insane buff for 3 energy. You're getting, what is that, 75 plus 15, 90? Is that 90? 90 power for 3 energy? Way too much, especially for a very common card that is not by any means difficult to get a hold of. So I think this card needs to say plus 15 this turn, or you really need to raise the energy cost of this card up quite significantly to counteract that. Because right now, Birds gets a lot of discounts on their cards, which makes them really easy to play out, even on lower energy weeks. And like I said, honestly, this card just needs to say plus 15 this turn. I think it's too strong. Moving on, I'm going to hit Birds again, honestly. I think this card is also one of the reasons late game Birds is a little too strong, because I've seen this card grow in people's hands to over 300 power very easily, just insane. So I think you take Dracula Parrot down, saying that the cards adjacent only lose 20 this turn, and then this card gains plus 40 perm instead of plus 60. I think that would help that out a little bit more. Let's see what else. Obviously, the big one most of you guys are talking about, that this card obviously is too strong, right? I do love that it kind of makes you create decks that are the, split certain, exactly 6 science, exactly 6 something else. I like that. I think that makes it interesting to try to build decks around. But in this meta right now, I do think this card is a little too strong at 21, because it's so easy to auto-include in most decks, right? And just build around this card and still have a fantastic deck. So I think this card, kind of like World Turtle, needs to be brought down a peg, probably closer to plus 18 until played instead of plus 21. I think that would do it just fine and still make it playable, but not crippling it to where it's not wanting to be played anymore. Next up, we know Egyptian decks have been running amok, and I want to talk about Curse of the Pharaohs. This is really the card that kind of did it, right? When this card was released, all you saw was Egypt decks, and this is why. Obviously, this card was too strong when it came out, so that plus 24 until played is probably a little too high, so I think we drop that down to plus 20, so they still get a good buff, good solid buff in its respective archetype, but it's not so significant like 24 that it's really, backbreaking anymore, I think. I think 20 would be just fine for a archetype buff. Let's stick with Egypt. I want to do one more nerf here, and I'm going to look at Eye of Horus. So Eye of Horus giving those Egyptian mythology and ancient Egypt cards plus 14 perm, which going into late game, obviously, is Egypt's very strong into late game. I think that's the problem, is it's a little too strong into late game. So let's drop this down to plus 10 perm. I think it's just fine. I do want to target one of the better limited legendary cards in the game at the moment. Maybe not. So what am I typing limited for? Maybe not super, super crazy, but I think it's really good. It's definitely a top-tier card, Han's Trap. When played, all cards in both players' hands lose 30 this turn, except for Festive. I like that. I love how they do cards like this. You'll see in my buffs, I'm actually going to try to buff some different archetypes around that mechanic, actually. But the return part, I think, is a little too strong, giving it a little too much gas late game. So let's drop it down from plus 60 perm to plus 50. Not a huge nerf, but I think it would hurt it just enough to make it not feel so backbreaking when it's played against you. And the last nerf I want to talk about is the Tower. This card has been seeing a ton of action lately, And I think it's just because what you get for 6 energy, right? You can get potential. It's not even really potential. It's pretty easy to do it every time and get 156 power on the turn from 6 energy, which is, in my mind, crazy. So you should not be getting that much power without even any buffs attached to this card. This card's going to get buffs attached to it too, right, from other cards. So for 6 energy, this card shouldn't be that much. So I think the plus 100 play stats for both those items need to drop down to plus 60. I think that's good. You still get almost 120 power for only 6 energy, which is really double what it should be already. So that's really strong already like that. So I think that would be a decent nerf for the tower. All right, that's all my nerfs. So we'll do mechanics last, because I do have some game mechanic ideas I want to bounce by you guys and see what you think. But we'll discuss some buffs, and I'll talk about why some of these I think would be interesting. So my first one up is the Battle of Waterloo, if I can find it. All right, so Battle of Waterloo, it's already decent, right? It's nothing crazy. When returned, if you lost the turn, gain plus 120 next turn. So it's setting you up for next turn. But what I would like it to add to it, on top of what it already says, is when played, all cards in both players' hands lose 40 this turn. And I say this because I want to create the archetype that I've showed you guys in a few of my videos, Scorched Earth, where you basically build your power per turn up, but as you're doing it, you're also playing these cards that ding both players' hands. I think it's a really fun archetype, and one I really think they should be expanding on and making it viable, because I think it's really fun to play, and I think a lot of players would have fun with it. And that's what this game needs, is something that's not so straightforward, like buff this card and okay, that's all I'm doing this game is just buffing my cards. It's just too straight lined. We need something to spice the game up, and that, in my mind, having cards that ding your opponent's power level at the same time you're gaining this power per turn, that I'm hurting myself in the process. But look, into late game now, I have 150, 200 power per turn stacked up, and I'm still getting power, but I'm dinging your power so bad you're hardly getting anything, right? So that's a fun archetype, guys. I think this card could be a card that sets it up. So because it would help you lose the turn if that turn everybody's losing 40 base power. So you could strategically play cards around that to try to lose the turn, and then next turn set yourself up for another big turn. So because in that archetype you would still get that plus 120 because it's going onto your base, basically your base power per turn stat. So that's kind of neat. I do want to follow that same mechanic because, like I said, I think this archetype needs a couple cards to really make it shine. And Kon-Tiki is perfect for this, I think, because right now this card says, when played, your opponent gains plus 40 this turn. Yeah, that's kind of dumb. And then when returned, your opponent loses 80 next turn. Okay, well, so instead, let's change it to, let's see. So I want to kill just the top when played section that our opponent gains 40. And I just want that to say all other cards in both players' hands lose 40 this turn. So this card wouldn't lose 40. Everything else essentially loses 40. So this would help, again, for our power per turn setup, where our opponent now is losing his power this turn, and then into next turn he's also losing an additional 80 power next turn. So I think that would be pretty good. Maybe could even drop the 80 down. That's quite a lot for only 4 energy of this cost. Maybe either make this card cost 5 or just bring that 80 down to maybe like 60 or something. I think that would still be really, really strong. So like I said, I want to create more archetypes. I still think that's the issue in this game, is there's not enough viable. All the fun archetypes, like the one I just mentioned, Scorched Earth, you got your burn decks, your lock decks, all these fun archetypes aren't viable. You just can't win games with them because there's so many cards that are buffing everything. It's just not fun. Like you can't win. We need these other decks to be viable. So another card I think we could change up, and I want to buff the debuff mechanic. I think everything's getting buffs, but there's not enough debuff cards coming in new to counter all these buff cards we're getting that are getting better and better and better. So I think, in my mind, Burn is not playable right now at all. They need to completely rework Burn, in my opinion. But I think you can, right now, as a temporary solution, switch some of these cards into debuff, like permanent debuff, because I think permanent debuff effects are not there's not as many of them as there should be, because that's really your only counter, I feel like, to these buff decks are the permanent debuff effects, and there's just not enough. I think Phoenix should be I would leave the first part the same. Your opponent's cards in hand, burn 14 until played. That's fine. We'll leave a burn effect in. It's okay. But this next part, if you're losing the round, so let's change that. If you're losing the round, so if you're losing the round, your opponent's cards in hand lose 14 permanently. So now we're going to ding our opponent's hand as well. Again, permanent power on top of the burn effect. So I think that would make this card definitely playable. Like, you're hitting permanent power, but it's an effect that only if you're losing. So as you get later in the game, you might not trigger it the second time because now you're winning. So it's not going to get broken to the fact that it's like, oh my gosh, that card's so good, I have to auto-include it. No, because it's only if you're losing the round, right? So I think that would be playable and make that card actually viable. I want to do the same thing with Jack-o'-lantern. So this idea is kind of off the back of Zorro. I think Zorro really kind of shows that archetype, what it could be. As on the return, you're debuffing what's left in your opponent's hand, permanent power. I like that idea. They just need to really expand on it, and you can make an archetype out of that easily. Make it viable, Let's do that. So Jack-o'-lantern, I think, is another one. A burn effect that's not strong enough. So we leave the draw effect, and let's change the return effect to, say, opponent's remaining cards in hand lose 20 perm. So you get the burn for 2 turns, and then you also get the return effect that their remaining cards, typically only 2 cards, right? Maybe 3 sometimes. But so this card would have a little more spread there to be good in certain instances where it's really dinging opponents' permanent power. And then you splash in some lock with that. Oh man, because you could set that up to where I'm locking your cards out, and then I play Jack-o'-lantern down. You can only play maybe 2 cards that turn. Look, now I've, on the return effect, I planned it out. Boom, now I'm hitting you with this permanent debuff. That's what I think. That would be a fun archetype, in my opinion, and they need to really expand on that. I think that would make this game a little more spicy, in my opinion. That's where it's lacking right now. A lot of people are just leaving because it's just too streamlined. There's just not enough variety. You're playing the same thing every time, and it just gets boring. All right, so next up, Inland Taipan. Kind of following the same suit we were just talking about. I know I'm kind of really beating this point in, but I think there's several of these cards that you could change and make this a viable option. So Inland Taipan, let's say scratch the life on land part, because I think that's really ding-dong that they did that. So now we have a lock card that's not specific to a life on land. It can just lock a random card in our opponent's hand for the turn. I think that's very good. We need to do that. And then we need to add a when played effect that says 2 opponents' random cards in the hand lose 20 perm. So I think that would make it, but maybe scratch that draw effect right there, that second draw effect, and then make it say what I just said. Basically, 2 opponents' random cards lose 20 perm instead of this burn thing that doesn't do anything. Next up, I'm going to talk another card that's kind of similar. Sorry, I'm hitting a lot of these same cards, but I really think this archetype could be what they need to go with to make this game a little more fun. Kinshi, let's change the second part to if you won the turn, your opponent's remaining cards in hand lose 20 perm. So and if you won the turn. So basically you're going to get that first part, but if you win, so added bonus, okay, now we ding our opponents again. But instead of stacking burn up, which doesn't make any sense, we're going to hit them for permanent power. All right. Next, I want to change 2 cards. I'm just going to talk both same time. It's Grendel. Card opposite loses 20 perm. Great. I love it. Right. And we also have Wink Murder. I'm going to Wink Murder now just because it's the same effect. You guys can see what I'm talking about on both cards at the same time. So this card, same thing, loses 20 perm, opposite. But I want to add a return effect to both these cards on top of what they already got that says, and if you lost the turn, so again, that stipulation of losing, I think they don't take advantage of that enough. I really like the early game. If you're behind, you're getting added bonus effects into the late game. I think that's an archetype that's kind of like Angela Walking. It's not taken advantage of enough, and people stray away from it. There's not I don't know if it's just because they read it and they're like, oh, that's bad, but it's fun if you play it. So that you guys need to try that out. Those decks like Angela Walking, it's really fun to strategically lose early to set yourself up for big wins late. It's a really fun archetype. I've been saying it for a while now, but I think these 2 cards could benefit from it as well. So basically add the effect, return effect, saying if you lost the turn, all cards in both players' hands lose 25 next turn. So now I can play this card in my Scorched Earth decks that are gaining power per turn and getting debuffed. So I like the fact of let's toss these in not only as they're a permanent debuff now, but they have that added both players lose 25 next turn. I really like all their cards lose 25 power. So that's going to help us get that. We need more of those debuff effects that actually hit permanent power, start debuffing late into late game. And it really helps that. I think it would really help that Scorched Earth archetype out. Same with Grim Reaper's going to touch on the Scorched Earth build as well. I'm going to keep the play part the same, but I want to add a return effect that gives it power per turn. And it can be small. I don't care. I just want like maybe 10 power per turn attached to this. I think that would make this card that card fit that archetype. And this is a card you want in the archetype. Grim Reaper, man. It just seems like it fits perfect. It's exactly what I want that card doing. All right, I'm going to jump out of this archetype now I've been talking about for a while. I want to help out new player decks because obviously we only have the one, basically birds and sharks is like all they play, right? So we need to branch in. I think one that could use a little help that could be decent is amphibians. You can see almost all these are new player cards. There's hardly any limited cards in there. There's one right there, but very little limited cards here. So I think this could be an easy one for new players to pick up. Let's look at a card that isn't doing anything right now. Nobody plays it. It's terrible. I've tried to build a deck around it, and it's just not good. It's very difficult to take 5 brilliant human body cards that have no connection to amphibians at all and make them both do this vice versa thing for plus 20. It's not a thing. Very bad. So what I would say is we just change this card up, and it says, when played, if your deck contains 3 brilliant human body cards, we're only going to buff our amphibians now. Your amphibians, wherever they are, gain plus 12 permanent power. So now we're going to give a permanent buff to amphibians only. We're not doing this vice versa thing, buffing brilliant body. I don't care about that. But I will say, okay, let's toss 3 brilliant human body cards in the deck. So because there's not tons of options for brilliant human body, I think that makes it to where it's actually playable at that point, because I could toss in, let's say, the brain, which is playable. I could toss in oxytocin, which is halfway playable. I could toss in, what was the other one I was thinking? There was another one. Maybe I'm blanking now. Well, anyway, basically you get the idea. Basically toss 3 of these in that are halfway playable, and instead of having to sacrifice 5 slots in your deck to make a card that's not viable, like nobody's going to do that. It's terrible. So I think that card can easily be reworked to make amphibians somewhat viable. And another card I want to make better for amphibians is this card here. Currently says when drawing your common and rare tremendous tree and reptile cards, wherever they are, gain plus 20 perm. All we got to do is attach the word and amphibian cards. So common and rare amphibians now would get plus 20 perm buff. I think that would make that card, or at least amphibians, a little more viable as an option, giving them more permanent power. So between that and Loveland Frog, both giving permanent effects, I think that would make amphibians shine. And I think it'd make it more interesting, right? So that's all the buffs I got for right now. Like I said, I was focusing on those like 3 archetypes, basically 1 for new players, and then 2 more that are just fun to play that I really wanted to kind of showcase what could happen, what would make those legitimate somewhat archetypes. Now, the last thing I do want to discuss before we leave today is mechanics. Like I said earlier, I think they just don't have enough. They're not putting out new mechanics. The reason Magic the Gathering has remained so popular for the last 30 years is they put out new ideas. They put out new mechanics all the time. Almost every new set that comes out, like when sets rotate, the next like rotation block always has something new that's included that's never been seen before. And that's after 30 years. You're telling me they're still coming up with new ideas that somehow have not been done yet. It blows my mind that they can just keep coming out with new stuff. And it's like, wow, how did nobody think of this before? Why aren't we doing that with this game? Right now they're keeping it so basic with, just you buff you, and you buff you. Who can make the best buffs? Can you buff your card better than I can buff my card? That's boring. Like, why aren't we adding fun abilities? That would make this game 10 times better. Now, I mean, that is my opinion, obviously. I mean, there's some of you out there I know specifically that want to keep the game very basic and just, okay, let's just, we just want to buff this card and buff that card, and I just want this card to buff that one. Okay, I get it. You're scared to change. You don't want some of these cards to break the game, but what I'm saying is test it out. You can always nerf a card after the fact, or don't put too many cards of that archetype in just yet. Test the waters with 1 or 2 cards. If it doesn't work, you can always take it out. It's not the end of the world. You're not breaking the game by adding 1 or 2 cards in, and if they are broken, you can fix it. It's not hard. So test the waters is what I'm saying. So here's some ideas I think would be fun to test. So for a mechanic, I think a bounce mechanic. So we can have control decks. I love Magic the Gathering because control is a thing. I love that fact of being able to manipulate and strategize and control specific outcomes of the game. That's what makes it interesting. So a bounce effect. Basically, I put out this card in front of your card, and once they flip, it triggers immediately that your card bounces back to your hand, and you have to choose another card from your hand that's left to replace it. So you're not down a card. You have the option to replace it. You might not want to replace it, though. So you might be down a card, especially if you can't afford the other card in your hand. So there's an element of interest there that I could really mess him up here and bounce a card, and he can no longer play another card because the other cards in his hand are too expensive. So you'd have to constantly strategize around now those bounce cards, like, oh, if I could get screwed here because I have too many expensive cards in my deck now. That's an element that you can kind of take advantage of now for these decks that get out of control with these big cards on those big heavy weeks. So I think a bounce mechanic would be very fun and very interesting to shake up the meta. Another idea I think could be interesting, very easy to do too, kind of goes with the losing theme, would be a card that on return you swap current power with your opponent. I think that, it sounds broken when you say it out loud, but think about it. How cool would it be to be losing the game on purpose you've held this card to swap now your stats at the last second? I think that'd be so cool. It's such an easy mechanic too. It probably would feel bad to lose that way, but again, it's not guaranteed you're losing. You could easily be winning or you could easily not get that card at the right time, or there could be a way to counter that. I don't know. I just think there's a way to maybe make something. Maybe it doesn't have to be all of your life total or something. Maybe you steal a percent, like maybe steal 100 power from their total or something. I don't know. There's probably a good way to do this, but like basically they've won a couple turns here, and you're gonna just swap their power around. I don't know. It's just something I thought of. I thought might be cool. One I really like, I've been saying for a long time now, I think would be a discard effect. Now, not from their hand. I think that's a little too broken to discard like one or two cards from their hand, because then they don't really have anything to play. I don't like that as much, but I think what could be a neat control aspect would be discarding the top card of their deck. So now it screws their cycling up, and I think that in this game would be so interesting to plan around and try to, oh man, I got to be careful because this card cycles. I need it in this specific slot, but if, he just discarded the top card of my deck, now I'm not going to draw it when I need it. Now I got to strategize a way to get my cards cycling how I need them. Yeah, it's a fine line, but I think it could be interesting to shake things up. Next up, I like a effect that maybe it's a one-time effect, but only triggers at the start of the game. So there's a lot of things that you could do with that, like giving yourself an advantage for the start of the game that your opponent now doesn't have. So basically asymmetrical starting ability, or starting something that starts. So for instance, one of my ideas would be at the start of the game, reduce your opponent's hand size to 4. So now your opponent plays with one less card for the entire game. Or increase my hand size to 6. I play with an extra card all game. Now maybe it helps me get cards a little quicker and I can get to different things better. There's a lot of stuff you could do with that start of game effect. That triggers, that card automatically triggers right when the game starts, no matter what. Doesn't have to be in your hand, just triggers every time. Hearthstone had a couple cards like that would just trigger. Once it's in your deck, it triggers every time, no matter what, at the start of the game. You automatically get it, like an added permanent effect. I think that'd be kind of cool. Like I said, there's a lot you could probably do with that. Another thing, the last one I've got is a draw effect. So I'm thinking a card you play down, and then you immediately draw. So it's a win-draw effect. So I play this card, I immediately draw an additional card into my hand, and then I choose a card to discard. So now I can basically cycle into my deck faster. So this draw and then immediately discard effect. So imagine that you play a card, play Heimdall down, you immediately draw another card from your deck, and you get to choose out of what's in your hand now. Let me discard this card. And then you can keep doing that. Imagine if you could just cycle through decks faster that way. I know that could break some things, but I mean, there's so many cards that they could just rework to fix. I mean, I don't think you'd break a whole lot, but I don't know. Just some ideas. I just want something new, something a little fresh, because right now all we have is lock, self-lock, burn, and they're all terrible. Most of them are self-lock's okay, but the lock and the burn are just terrible, and that's like the only effects we got in this game. Why is it hard to create new effects? I don't understand. All right, guys, that's my rant for the video, I guess. But let me know in the comments what you think. If you like any of the Nerf ideas, buff ideas, mechanics, just shoot me some comments. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. Have